Life has a way of derailing your plans, which is why I've given up on making any. Before my divorce, I was all about planning. I'd anticipate every possible emergency at work and always had backup plans at the ready. But today, I got a call that I had to meet my ex-wife. I hadn't seen her in over a year, and frankly, I wasn't excited about it. But since my daughter insisted, I had no choice but to go. Bella, my daughter, was insistent, so I drove back to town. The traffic on the freeway was a nightmare, and it took me nearly an hour to reach the city hospital where Bella had brought her mom. I parked and hoped my visit wouldn't drag on. At the information desk, I discovered that my ex-wife, Natalie, had been hospitalized for 2 days. A nurse led me to her room but mentioned she was still asleep. "What's wrong with her?" I asked. The nurse began to say, "Your wife," but I interrupted, "Ex-wife. Very ex-wife," with a forced smile. The nurse returned a small smile but then grew serious. Behind me, Bella said, "Dad, you're not flirting with the nurse while Mom's in the hospital, are you?" I replied, "Of course not, Bella. If I were flirting, I'd at least make it obvious." I glanced at the nurse. "Allison," she said. I responded, "Oh, that name suits you." Bella then pushed me into her mom's room, ending our brief moment of lightness. The room was a grim sight. 4 beds in the most dismal place I'd ever been, hospital or otherwise. Bella commented, "This room is terrible, huh?" I shrugged. "Dad, she's here because she doesn't have health insurance. Pal can't add her to our plan. The only person who could is—" Her voice trailed off. "Bella, sweetie, I love you more than anything, and I'd do almost anything for you. But you need to understand that your mom and I are divorced." "I did everything the judge ordered, though not everything she wanted," Bella said softly. We stood beside the bed, looking at the sleeping woman. "She never wanted a divorce, you know," Bella whispered. "She still loves you, even now." "People in hell want ice water," I replied coldly. "But they're there because of what they did. Your mom and I are divorced because of her actions during our marriage." Bella said, "I know what she did. I was there. But I can't help feeling you two still belong together. She loves you so much, Dad. Look at her. She's falling apart." "Some people just don't age well," I said, my tone harsh. "Maybe she should have taken better care of herself." Bella shot back. "She needs her husband. She needs love and care. That's why she's deteriorating. You woke me up for this?" "Who's her husband?" I mocked. "Do you even have any compassion?" Bella asked. "You don't know compassion," I snapped. "I endured years with her, gave her chances, but she never could move on." "Dad, don't you want to settle down and enjoy life?" Bella asked. "Been there, done that," I replied bitterly. "Thought I had that person. Loved her enough to put my pride aside and try to fix things, even after I discovered what she was doing. But she couldn't let go." "Some women can love 2 men at once," Bella said. "And some men can handle that," I retorted. "But not me. Why am I here anyway?" "I've been here since we brought her," Bella said. "I needed a break, to go home, shower, change, and see my husband. Pal sat with her yesterday, but he doesn't like Mom. He used to until I stopped. 3 families almost torn apart because of 2 messed up people," I said. "Maybe they belong together." "Don't you have any compassion?" Bella asked. "Sometimes I can't find my heart," I snapped. She ripped it out. "Didn't you already get your revenge?" I walked away. "I still don't understand," Bella said. "You're not the type to walk away. There's so much I don't get in these 2 years since the divorce." "Like what?" I asked. "We split everything except the house. It just doesn't make sense," she said. "Mom didn't want any of that stuff. She just wanted you. And it seemed like you guys should have had way more money than you actually did. Mom's lawyer went over all our finances," I shrugged. "So, Dad, why are you driving a customized Mustang that my husband says cost at least $50,000 when Mom can't even afford a car?" she asked. "Maybe my credit is better," I said. "Anyway, I'll sit here and play games on my iPad while she sleeps for a few hours. I'll give you a break, honey. Hopefully, she won't wake up. If she does, I'll call you immediately." "What's wrong with her anyway?" I asked. "Dad, Mom has been diagnosed with severe depression symptoms. She's on medication for it. For some reason, she took all her pills at once. We had to have her stomach pumped. She also hasn't been eating properly and has been drinking too much. She's exhausted and dehydrated, and we still don't know if she took the pills by accident or if she was trying something, Bella explained. So the chances are she probably was trying something, she concluded. So, the chances are she probably won't even wake up, right? I asked with a forced smile. Right, Bella confirmed. But Dad, if she does wake up, please be nice to her for my sake. All right, Bella, I agreed. My daughter gave me a kiss on the cheek and then left the room. I settled into the chair beside the bed and pulled out my iPad. I began by opening the book I was reading, but soon found myself drifting back to 2 years ago when everything started falling apart. We do odd things for our kids. When Bella was little, she loved creating bizarre candy mixtures. I adored her so much that I'd eat whatever she concocted and pretend it was amazing. There was this one time she invited us over for dinner. It was nice, but Emily's cooking was still hit or miss. The roast was terribly dry. Kyle kept refilling my drink, probably because he knew the roast wasn't up to par. Fortunately, I don't drink much, or I would have ended up tipsy. Spending time with family was enjoyable. I spent some time with Emily's son, Mark, who was named after me. He was cute and seemed to do no wrong in my eyes. The best part of the evening was when Sam and Kyle announced they were expecting again. Kyle, what are you doing to my daughter? I joked. We chatted about the usual topics when kids are on the way. We all liked the name Elizabeth for a girl, after Kyle's mother. I suggested Peter for a boy, after Kyle's father, which he liked. But then things took a turn. Natalie said, "You already have a grandkid named after you. Let someone else choose this time. What do you have in mind?" I teased. "Let me guess. Natalie for a girl, Eric for a boy?" "Actually, I was thinking Jason," she replied. "We could call him Brian. Jason James Brooks sounds nice." The atmosphere shifted abruptly. Emily looked at me with concern. "I'm not sure about that," she said. "I preferred Dad's suggestion. Don't you, Kyle?" Kyle hadn't looked at me yet. He was still smiling, likely imagining how pleased his dad would be with a grandkid named after him. He simply nodded. Natalie reached out for my hand, but I pulled away sharply. Emily didn't notice my reaction. "What do you think, Dad?" she asked. I replied coldly, "I think naming him that would be as big a mistake as the one your mother just made." It was one of those moments you see in movies or TV shows where everyone's at a party having a great time. Dancing, music blaring, people eating and laughing. Then someone does something really awkward, and everything comes to a screeching halt. Usually, the music stops, and there's this uncomfortable sound like a needle scratching on an old record. That's how it felt. For what seemed like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Kyle broke the silence diplomatically. "Wow, I really need to get to bed. I have an early meeting tomorrow." "Thanks for a great evening, Kyle," I said. "I love you, Bella." I stood up and headed for the door. As I was opening it, Emily called out, "Dad, what's wrong with you? Aren't you forgetting something?" "Well, come over here and hug me, Bella," I said. "I need to get out of here. I can't even breathe." "I was talking about Mom," she said with a smirk. "I thought you didn't drink." "Kyle, what have you been putting in my father's glass all night?" she asked. "It's Pepsi, sweetheart," I replied, though right now, I could really use a drink. "What's wrong with you, Mark?" Natalie asked as she came over to me. She reached out again, and this time, I moved away so obviously that everyone noticed. "We'll talk about this when we get home, honey," she said. "We aren't doing anything," I snapped. "I'm going back to my place. I don't know what you're up to or where you're going, but it's not with me." Wait a minute, Dad," Emily said. "You're upset because Mom didn't like the name you suggested?" Natalie's eyes widened as she realized I was aware of her secret. "No, honey," I said. "I'm not angry at all. I've just finally come to my senses. Sometimes the people who love you do things that hurt you, and you try to overlook them. Sometimes you suffer silently, hoping that if you just get through this one issue, things will improve. But then something happens that makes you realize all that suffering was for nothing. Some things just can't be ignored." Everyone in the room was staring at me, except Natalie, who already knew what I was referring to. "Dad, you're not making any sense," Emily said. "Bella, Your mother wants to name my grandson after the man she's been in love with for the past 15 years, the guy she had an affair with. She found out a few days ago that he recently died. She's trying to keep his memory alive through my grandson." Both Emily and Kyle looked at Natalie, who had collapsed on the floor, sobbing silently. "I'm so sorry, Mark," Natalie said. "It's over. It's been over for more than 5 years. I've been trying to be the best wife I could." "Why did it end, Natalie?" I asked. "Because I felt so guilty," she said. "I knew what I was doing was wrong, so I ended it. Can't we talk about this? It wasn't an affair. We only met once a year." "We only met once a year," Natalie said, her voice shaky. "And we didn't always even have sex. But whenever I came back home, you and I always had the best sex we've ever had. It's been over for a long time. I love you, Mark. We needed to talk about this. You don't understand how bad it really is." "It's worse than you think, Natalie," I snapped back. "Maybe once the divorce is finalized, you'll tell someone the truth, but I'm done with your lies." "What do you mean?" she asked, looking confused. I made it clear. "Natalie, if it were up to your deceitful self, you'd still be seeing him." "I told you I ended it," she retorted. "And you're lying again," I said. "I ended it." "You what?" she asked. "I went to Boston and found him 5 years ago," I said. "I beat him up badly. He was in the hospital before your pathetic cheating self was even off the plane. I took his phone and got all of your texts. I might use them as evidence. I also warned him that if he ever came near you again, it would be his last day on earth. I told him I'd let his wife know about the affair, and that if he ever tried to contact you again, even just as a friend, I'd be back. So you didn't end anything, Natalie." "I did." "Mark, I'm sorry," she said, tears in her eyes. "I was wrong. I was confused. It was a mistake." "I'm sorry too, Natalie," I said coldly. "I was wrong too. I was confused too. I made a mistake too. I was wrong for trying to save this messed up marriage. I did it for Bella. I didn't want her to deal with our split until she was out on her own. I thought maybe with time, and because I loved you so much, we could get past this. But I made a mistake. Instead of ending this farce back then, I actually tried to make it work." "At least you were right about one thing, honey. You did end something. From the moment you mentioned his name tonight, you ended our marriage." I left the house, got into my car, and drove off. I spent a long time that night just driving around. The roar of my Mustang's engine and the thrill of speeding through the moonlit night eased some of my pain. I turned off my phone so I wouldn't be disturbed. Honestly, I wasn't as upset as I seemed. I had known about her infidelity for over 5 years and had been preparing for the divorce in every possible way. Natalie was probably more shocked by tonight's events than I was. First, she had no idea I knew about her affair. And second, she only learned tonight why it ended. She had flown to Boston for a conference, the same one she attended every year. She booked a room at the usual hotel and told me the conference was a 2-day seminar when it was actually just one. After the conference, she had dinner with Jason. They chatted until the restaurant closed, and she even mentioned me a few times. When the restaurant closed, they shared a passionate kiss before she headed back to her room and Jason went to his car to drive home. As he reached his car, I was sitting on the hood. "Hey, that's my car," he said. "I'm sorry," I replied. "It's wrong for people to mess with things that don't belong to them, isn't it, Brian?" "I totally agree," he said. "Let's not talk about hubcaps, Brian. Let's talk about Claire, your wife, who is currently waiting for you at your house on Sycamore Street. It's probably too late to visit her now. I should wait until tomorrow." "I'm calling the police," Brian said. I pulled out my phone and offered it to him. "Brian, you can call the police anytime. It'll be my word against yours, and either way, you'll lose because the truth about you spending time with my wife while your faithful wife waits at home will come out." Brian's face went ashen. "I'm not the sharing type, Brian," I said. "I think you've made a mistake," he said. "I do know Natalie, but we haven't spent any time together." He looked at me, seeing the seriousness in my eyes. "Okay, we had dinner tonight. Some things we learned at the conference were interesting, and we both wanted someone to discuss them with, but that's it. Nothing happened. We just lost track of time." "Wow," I said. "You had me worried." He smiled. relieved we cleared things up. Then, I punched him as hard as I could. He went down like a bowling pin. He got up and started running, so I threw his hubcap at him, hitting him in the face. He fell again, and when he got up and started running, I threw the hubcap again, this time hitting his legs. He tripped and fell heavily. I pounced on him and beat him mercilessly until his face was a mess. "You really had me worried, Brian," I said. "For a moment, I thought I wouldn't get to beat the crap out of you. I know you only had dinner tonight." I was there. "But what about last year or the year before? How long has this been going on?" "Maybe 15 or 20 years, he stammered through his mangled lips. "It's over, Brian," I said. He nodded quickly. "If you so much as mention her name again, I'll end your marriage and your life. Are we clear?" He nodded again. "Don't visit her, don't write to her, and don't call her. There will be no more warnings." "I got it," he said. "Brian, the next time we talk won't be so pleasant," I warned. It seemed to work. When I got back home, Natalie was her usual self after a conference. She tried to rekindle things with passionate lovemaking, but I just wasn't interested. Usually, after Natalie returned from the conference, we'd go on vacation together. That year, I pretended to be too busy to get away. Despite my efforts to move past it, I couldn't shake the anger. A big part of me was in Judas Priest mode. For those who don't know, Judas Priest is a heavy metal band, and their album Screaming for Vengeance was how I felt, fueled by rage and seeking vengeance. I wanted blood. I wanted someone to pay for my pain. If misery loves company, I wanted someone to be miserable with me. I chose Brian. Through some business connections, I got him fired. I didn't gloat or let him know it was me. It was enough that I knew. It felt satisfying, almost like the warm glow I used to get from doing something nice for Natalie, but now it was from causing Brian harm. I spent the next 5 years making his life miserable. Meanwhile, I was certain that a divorce between Natalie and me was inevitable. Why didn't I confront her and file for divorce? Despite her betrayal, I still loved her. Deep down, I wanted to believe her and give her another chance. But my rational side, as always, advised me to be prepared for anything. I told Natalie we were under a raise freeze at work while I was actually getting a raise. A few months later, after working for a promotion for 10 years, I finally got it. I didn't tell Natalie. My salary nearly doubled, and I redirected most of the new income into accounts she knew nothing about. 2 years later, I got another promotion and raise, again keeping her in the dark. This secrecy was strategic. If and when our divorce happened, she'd be clueless about my true income. She'd genuinely believe I was still making $40,000 a year. My boss, having been badly treated in his own divorce, was more than willing to assist. Officially, I was listed as a mid-level manager, and no one questioned why other managers deferred to me. It was just how the company operated. 3/4 of my real salary was funneled through another company that appeared to be one of our vendors. I wasn't an officer or owner of this company. Its officers were my fishing buddies. In exchange for their names, I took them fishing once or twice a year. They were listed as volunteers, so there were no salary or tax implications for them. The money went directly into my offshore account, leaving no trace. I withdrew some of the money a few times. Once was after Emily and Kyle got married. I made a large down payment on their house, easing their financial burden without buying the house outright. Their mortgage payments were under $100 a month. I also bought them a second car since they both worked in different parts of town. It made their lives easier. Even with these gifts, I had to be cautious. My method of giving them the house and car worked in my favor, allowing me to give Natalie even less. The money for the house was supposedly from my retirement account, reducing my apparent assets. The car was funded by a loan, further diminishing my disposable income and reducing Natalie's potential share. One advantage of my situation was that Jason worked in manufacturing, inspecting castings. My company was also manufacturing-based, with numerous direct-to-factory concerns across the country. I had a private investigator friend in Boston who kept tabs on Brian. Whenever he got a job, I'd have one of our account executives meet with someone from Brian's company. If we had an account with them, Brian got fired. If we didn't, we'd acquire one, and then Brian would lose his job. I maintained a spreadsheet tracking Brian's misfortunes, some of which I didn't even cause. Over time, His reputation in the manufacturing community deteriorated so badly that he couldn't even secure interviews. By the time of his passing, his last jobs were in landscaping or day labor. His personal life suffered too. His wife had to return to work to support the family. I avoided interfering with her career because I had nothing against her. I made sure Brian's children received everything they deserved. I single-handedly got his daughter into law school by inventing a scholarship just for her. It provided full funding for her degree, and she never knew where it came from. Her grades were excellent, and she received bonuses from her mysterious benefactor. The scholarship ended once she graduated, leaving her unaware of my role in her success. The fact that Brian couldn't support his family and barely contributed to their upkeep weighed heavily on him. He was a proud man, driven by a need to be self-sufficient and a provider. Discovering he was neither deeply wounded his pride. He turned to drinking, which gradually consumed him. To his credit, he never became violent or abusive towards his wife or daughter. But in the end, he was merely a shadow of the man he once was. I also reflected on how my actions had changed me. I was no longer the person I'd been when I first discovered my wife's betrayal. I had always been soft-spoken and easygoing, open and honest. But the trauma of Natalie's continuous infidelity had unhinged me. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a psychopath capable of methodically dismantling a man's life over an affair. I still saw Mark Ellis, the all-around nice guy and family man. Shouldn't a villain have some recognizable traits? Back in the day, villains wore black hats. Maybe I should trade my Mustang for a black one. Yet, despite these musings, I couldn't stop myself. My shattered heart craved revenge more than healing. My soul demanded vengeance far more than forgiveness. As I watched Brian's life unravel, I also kept a close eye on Natalie. Her betrayal had eroded my ability to trust anyone completely. It's a terrible thing to lose faith in the person you vowed to love and cherish forever. Natalie's affair not only destroyed our marriage, but also my ability to trust. For 5 years, while I crushed Brian, I prepared for the inevitable divorce. Unlike most men who have only days or weeks to safeguard their assets, I had 5 years. I had initially planned to wait longer, hoping Natalie would age further, but Brian's decline was faster than I anticipated. Over those 5 years, I hid and squirreled away as much money as I could. I didn't need to worry about the house because it wasn't ours. The home had been in my family for generations, and my parents, still alive, no longer needed such a large place. During the divorce, I made sure the lawyers knew my parents owned the house and simply allowed me to live there rent-free. When Natalie returned from the conference, she texted Brian about how much she enjoyed their dinner and the wonderful kiss they shared. She mentioned missing their physical intimacy, but was glad it hadn't happened this year. She expressed guilt over her unfaithfulness, assuming Brian felt the same way about his wife. She told him their current sexless romance was better because it allowed them to enjoy their relationship without guilt, until they both passed away. She ended the text with, "Until next year, my love." I read that text while waiting for my luggage at the airport. The betrayal stung deeply. Even though I still loved Natalie in some ways, my feelings for her had changed drastically. It was challenging to maintain composure. When Natalie got home, I was in the den, watching a football game. She came in, wrapped her arms around me, and tried to kiss me. I pulled away, claiming I had a cold and didn't want to make her sick. "Just make sure we're better by this weekend," she said with a smile. "Why? What's happening this weekend?" I asked. "You and I are going on vacation together, remember? We always go after my boring conference," she replied. "Well, maybe you could do a mother-daughter vacation with Sam this year," I suggested. "I really can't get away from work this weekend." "But honey, it's the weekend. You'd only miss 2 days of work. Think about it. 4 nights and 3 days in Hawaii, just the two of us. Thinking about it gets me hot. We might never leave the hotel room. I bought all kinds of nasty new things to wear for you." I wondered how many of those things Brian might have seen if they'd met up earlier. "Natalie, we're under a wage freeze, and the company is cutting costs everywhere. I have to make sure they don't think I'm one of the costs they could cut," I said. "I understand, honey," she said. "I'll call Sam. But I want you in the bedroom 10 minutes after I get upstairs." She went upstairs, and I heard her talking to Emily on the phone. At the same time, she texted Brian again. asking if he'd received her previous message. It disgusted me. When I didn't come to bed, she came looking for me. I pretended to be asleep on the couch. Over the next few weeks, I came to terms with everything. It was a big adjustment, but I became a far better actor than I ever imagined. We continued to have sex about as regularly as before. I don't know if Natalie enjoyed it as much, but I certainly did. I no longer cared about pleasing her. I was indifferent to whether she reached climax or not. I began viewing Natalie differently. Instead of seeing her as my beloved wife, I saw her merely as a woman I was sleeping with. Our sex became rawer and less loving, but also more adventurous. Natalie, who had always been somewhat vanilla in bed, surprised me. During her guilt-ridden phase just after the conference, she indulged my every desire, and we explored new experiences. Before Natalie could protest or claim she wasn't that kind of woman, she was. When the conference came around again the following year, I watched her closely for any signs of contact with Brian. I checked her phone account online and saw no calls from the Boston area, but she had sent several texts to Brian. She grew increasingly frustrated when he didn't respond. Natalie tried reaching out through mutual friends, discovering that Brian had suffered a brutal beating and robbery after the previous conference. He had been fired and was now elusive. Natalie's attempts to reconnect with Brian, including asking a mutual friend to visit his house and convey her desire to hear from him, were met with disappointment. Brian claimed he didn't remember her and, since he no longer worked in the industry or attended the conference, saw no reason to get in touch. Natalie was heartbroken. She confided in me that she didn't feel up to attending the conference that year, but I insisted she go. After all, she attended every year and had to endure it. This year should be no different. My flight landed 2 hours after hers, and I tracked her closely. Natalie didn't stay overnight. She returned home at the end of the day. While she was heading to the airport, I called her, expressing how much I missed her and that I had to go out of town for the evening. She responded by saying she couldn't stand being apart and was flying home early. I had expected her to seek out another man, but she didn't. She attended the lectures and expo, then flew home. The following year, Natalie tried to persuade me to attend the conference with her, so I could see how boring it was. After that, she stopped going altogether. For the past 2 years, Natalie had been entirely faithful. I occasionally monitored her or hired a private investigator for a few days. She had done nothing to raise suspicion. If I didn't know better, I would have thought she was the perfect wife. At least she tried to be. The problem was, once trust is broken, things can never return to how they once were. As we relaxed on our deck in our big swing, I wondered if she was reminiscing about Brian and their idealistic love. When she woke me on a lazy Sunday morning with intimate gestures, I questioned whether she was imagining doing the same with Brian. As a result, I could never fully give Natalie my heart again. No matter how romantic she tried to be, I always suspected ulterior motives. For the past 5 years, Natalie had become merely a maid with benefits, an expensive one at that. In the 2 years leading up to the divorce, I often scrutinized her body. Sometimes I felt like a farmer inspecting his crops. I'd notice, yep, her tits are starting to sag, or see a few more lines on her face and think, we're getting there. I'd jokingly suggest she have another piece of cake, remarking on how it didn't matter because our marriage was nearing its end. She'd smile and hug me, or give me a peck on the cheek, believing I still loved her no matter how much weight she gained. In truth, I didn't care if she gained 100 pounds. It wouldn't matter because I was convinced our marriage was on the brink of ending. Our life appeared good on the surface. We had friends, enjoyed activities together, and spent time with our daughter and her husband. For years, I almost believed Natalie had forgotten her affair, or thought she had gotten away with it. 5 years is a long time. If nothing had surfaced by now, did it still matter? A few days before the ill-fated dinner, a private investigator friend in Boston informed me that Brian had lost his latest job. He was working in the fast food industry, but due to his drinking problem, the manager wouldn't let him work inside the restaurant. Instead, Brian was stuck maintaining the landscaping for minimum wage, shoveling snow, cutting grass, and on some days, dressing as the restaurant's clown mascot to spin a sign advertising the place. Brian had hit rock bottom. In his late 40s, with a college degree, he was working for minimum wage and dressed as a clown, while his teenage coworkers looked down on him as a cautionary tale. One of the kids even told his mother, right in front of Brian, that despite working inside the restaurant and earning more than minimum wage, he was better off than Brian. The kid saw no point in going to college if it meant ending up like Brian. This kind of commentary pushed Brian further into depression. One day, in a fit of frustration, Brian threw his sign in the air. It landed on a customer, startling her and knocking her food out of her hands. The customer began yelling, and Brian, in a drunken rage, began kicking her hamburger down the street like a hockey puck and hurling insults at her. He was fired immediately. With his last paycheck, Brian bought a bottle of alcohol and a rope. Back at home, he used his college degree one last time, this one in manufacturing technology, to create a noose. He climbed onto a chair, wrapped the noose around his neck, and began drinking. As he drank, he reflected on his life's failures and the joy he had lost. He thought about his career, his daughter's loss of respect, and his marriage, which had deteriorated to the point where he and his wife slept in separate bedrooms. Brian's downward spiral wasn't solely due to career failures, but also how he dealt with each successive setback. The distance between him and his wife grew as he waited for the next disaster. Brian died never knowing that I had orchestrated his downfall. He thought it was all just bad luck. I had always intended to reveal my role in his ruin someday, as a final act of vengeance, but I never got the chance. His last thoughts were consumed by his anger towards Natalie. He traced his misfortune back to his affair with her, though he never admitted his own culpability. His bad luck began when Natalie's husband discovered the affair and severely beat him, setting off a chain of misfortunes that never seemed to end. In his final moments, he wished he had never met Natalie. His last words reflected his bitterness towards her, his brain succumbing to the effects of alcohol as he lost consciousness. When Brian's wife found his body, she felt a mix of sadness and relief. She was glad he was free from his suffering, even if she couldn't muster much emotion. One of Natalie's former colleagues, who knew both Natalie and Brian, emailed her about his death. Natalie was stunned. I had already been informed by my PI, so I was prepared for her reaction. Her response was unexpected. I couldn't tell if her distress was due to losing a past friend or if it was a reflection on the fragility of life. That night, she clung to me desperately, trying to make love as if to reaffirm our bond. She cried a little, and when I asked why, I wasn't sure what to expect. I was bracing myself for her to reveal that she had lost a friend from her past. But what Natalie said was far from what I expected. "I just love you so much," she said, tears in her eyes. "And I'm so glad to have you. I don't know what I'd do if anything ever happened to take you away from me." I felt a pang of old affection. Maybe I was a sucker, but her words got to me one last time. That night, our intimacy was different. We made love as we used to, passionate, tender. I did things I hadn't done in years. Instead of just getting through it and then retreating to watch the news, I took my time kissing her, holding her, letting her know that I loved her too. I allowed myself to believe, foolishly, that maybe I was healing and could trust her again. It felt as if a scab had finally formed over my wounded heart. The next night, at dinner with Emily and Kyle, I held Natalie's hand, and we exchanged longing glances. Emily even remarked on how much in love we still seemed after all these years. But then Natalie had to ruin it all. She blurted out her plan to name our grandchild after Brian. That was the final straw. Despite all the damage I'd inflicted on Brian over the years, it wasn't enough. I had spent 5 years preparing for this moment, and I now understood why it had never been enough. I realized that while Brian had deserved some of what he got, Natalie deserved even more. What I had done to Brian was like unloading a full clip into him and then reloading and firing again. But Brian was not the sole source of my pain. Natalie, who had vowed to love and cherish me before God and our friends, was the true source of my suffering. Before confronting Brian in Boston and confronting him physically, I barely knew him. My actions had been shameful and cowardly, like a high school student beating up a nerd in retaliation for being pushed by a jock. In the days following the dinner, I began preparing to cut Natalie out. I packed up her clothes and personal items and told her to come by on Saturday to collect her belongings. I instructed her to bring Emily and Kyle along so that any items she took could be verified. I planned to be away all day Saturday and return only when she was done. But things didn't go as planned. When I arrived home that Saturday evening, Natalie and Emily were still there, and they wanted to talk. Natalie began with, "Mark, I love you. I love you with all my heart. I would never do anything to hurt you on purpose. I'm so sorry, more than you can imagine. I was cold." "Oh, I believe you're sorry. You might be the sorriest excuse for a wife I've ever seen." "Can't we talk about this?" she asked. "We've been together almost 30 years. We can't just throw all that away over something that happened and ended a long time ago." "Mark, why didn't you confront me about this when you found out?" Natalie continued. "I can't imagine how much pain you've been carrying for the past 5 years. I'm beginning to understand why there's been a wall between us. This is the reason, isn't it?" I sighed and nodded. "And that last night was wonderful," she added. "It was the best sex we've ever had. You must have found out about Brian's death and thought everything was behind us until I opened my mouth." I nodded again. "Mark, can you let me talk?" Natalie pleaded. "I need to get this out. I know what I did was wrong, but it's been over for years. I have questions for you once I'm done. Please." "Natalie," I said, "I don't have to listen to anything you say. I could throw you out right now, but I will let you talk, just to ensure that when we go to court, you can't claim I didn't give you a chance to explain. So go ahead." I was ready to hear her explanations. "When did this start with Brian and why?" "Okay, Mark," Natalie began. "It's 2010 now. We got married in 1980, so I guess it started in 1982. 28 years?" I shouted. I had no idea it had been that long. "I guess Brian and I looked at it differently," Natalie said. "Maybe he only counted it from when we started sleeping together." I glanced at Emily, who looked at her mother with concern. "Mark, there's no chance Emily is anyone's child but yours," Natalie said. "The conference is in July. Emily was born in January. It's just not possible," I said, frustration seeping into my voice. "But you kind of hoped, didn't you?" I spat the words, unable to hold back my anger. "Don't tell me the possibility never crossed your mind." Emily glanced at her mother, her face betraying unease. "Bella, angel, I love you more than life itself," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "For the past 5 years, you've been the only person I could trust completely. Most of my heart is yours, baby, but could we do a DNA test? It doesn't matter now in the least. I'll never treat you or my grandkids any different. I just need to verify this." "Mark, I already told you," Natalie began. "Why should I believe anything you've ever said?" I interrupted, calm but resolute. "From the very start of our marriage, you've been lying to me. Since our marriage is over, it means you lied to me for the entire time. So, no, Natalie, I'm not sure I can trust a word you say now." "No, Mark, it's not like that," Natalie pleaded. "I love you. I've always loved you. You just don't understand." "Well, start talking," I said. "I'm giving you a chance to make me understand, but you need to give it everything you've got. This is the last time we'll be speaking without going through lawyers." "Mark, you're not serious," Natalie said, her voice trembling. "I only cheated on you once, and that was years ago. It isn't worth throwing away 30 years together over something that ended a long time ago. For the past 5 years, I haven't seen or heard from Brian. You're punishing me for something that ended a long time ago. I think that's unfair. You're not thinking straight." "I know you haven't seen or heard from Brian in 5 years," I said. "But you did try to contact him 4 years ago, didn't you? The year after the last conference you attended together. You tried to find out when he'd be arriving for your yearly get-together, but he didn't respond to your texts." "I tried to reach him through friends," Natalie admitted. "They told me he didn't remember me. He did remember me, but he was afraid. He knew if he answered, you'd either beat him to a pulp or worse, tell his wife and ruin his marriage." "So, you know it's over," she said, a small, relieved smile on her face. "How do I know that?" I asked. "The last thing you sent him was a text message saying your love would last until one of you died. It's barely been 5 years. But oh, wait, he is dead now, isn't he? Maybe you weren't lying after all. You did love him enough to try to get Sam to name my grandson after him, even though it cost you our marriage. No, Mark, you don't understand, Natalie said, her voice breaking. You and I had only been married for 2 years when I went to that first conference. I met Brian there, and he was the nicest guy. I missed you a lot. It was the first time I'd ever been away from you. I kept trying to call you, but you were working. Brian and I started talking, and he made me feel comfortable. He was so much like you. The next year, we met again, and we grew even closer. We even had dinner together. We talked until they kicked us out of the restaurant. I didn't want to stop talking to him, but a lot of it was because he was so much like you. We hadn't been together for that long, and sometimes I needed to run things by someone to see how you'd react. It wasn't until the 4th year that we slept together, and it was an accident. We were both drunk, and we ended up in bed. We woke up the next morning, consumed with guilt. We didn't even say goodbye. The next year, we avoided each other. I was pregnant with Sam that year, so unless Emily took over a year to come to term, there's no way Brian could be her father. We didn't even have dinner or talk that year. The year after, Brian came to me, apologizing for everything that had happened 2 years prior. He blamed himself and thought it was foolish for us to avoid each other because of a mistake. So, we had dinner. And honestly, for over 2 years, I'd been avoiding him and fantasizing about what it had been like. We were both drunk, and I wanted to remember. By then, it had been 6 years, and we'd only slept together once. And then, it had been a drunken mistake. That year, we only had dinner. The following year, nothing happened, but there was a weird tension between us. It felt like we only went to the conferences to see each other. Year 8, to break that tension, we had sex again. I feel the most guilt about that. For the past 3 years, I'd been avoiding him and fantasizing about what sex with Brian would be like. It was awful. Worse than awful. Boring. Brian's equipment didn't match yours, and he knew what his wife liked, but it wasn't the same as what I liked. I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The next year, I avoided Brian completely. I didn't even speak to him. I basically hid. I did go over to him towards the end, pretending I'd just run into him after searching for him for a long time. I asked him a lot of questions about his wife and then left. The year after that, marked a decade of us attending the conference together. It was meant to be a celebration of our enduring friendship with Brian, and he was waiting for me at the airport with a mix of nostalgia and anticipation. He talked about how special it was that we had managed to keep in touch for so long. To him, it was an anniversary of sorts, a testament to our friendship's endurance. I felt a pang of guilt for what I was about to put him through, but I also knew that I couldn't continue this facade any longer. Over the years, the situation with Brian had become a tangled mess of emotions and obligations. What began as a genuine friendship had slowly morphed into something much more complicated. Initially, our meetings were about catching up and sharing experiences, but as time went on, they became a routine, a yearly ritual that I didn't know how to escape. I had convinced myself that it was just a harmless continuation of our old connection, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I can't fully explain why I let this go on for so long. It wasn't just about Brian. It was about me struggling with a sense of loss and confusion. I found solace in maintaining a connection that, while flawed, felt familiar and comforting. But over time, it became apparent that what I was doing was wrong. I was trying to hold on to something that was never meant to be permanent, and it was tearing at the fabric of our life together. The encounters with Brian were never wild or passionate. They were more about a routine we had fallen into. Every year, I endured it because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. It became a grim acceptance of something I no longer enjoyed but felt obligated to maintain. I kept telling myself it was only once a year, and it was no big deal. But in reality, it was a series of poor choices that accumulated into a significant breach of trust. Reflecting on this, I realize how misguided and damaging my actions were. I should have ended things with Brian long before I did. I allowed myself to be caught in a cycle of guilt and obligation, all while ignoring the fact that I was compromising the integrity of our relationship. It was a betrayal not just of our marriage, but of the love and commitment we had shared for decades. Mark, I want you to know that my feelings for you have always been real and profound. What we have together is irreplaceable, and I now understand how my actions have undermined that. It was never my intention to replace you or diminish our relationship. I made a series of mistakes out of fear, confusion, and a misguided sense of loyalty. But I am now acutely aware of how these mistakes have hurt you and our life together. I am asking for another chance not just to prove that I am committed to fixing what's broken, but because I genuinely believe that our marriage can be salvaged. I want to go to counseling, work through our issues, and rebuild the trust that has been shattered. I am prepared to do whatever it takes to make amends and to show you that my love for you is unwavering. I know that forgiveness is not easy, and rebuilding trust will take time. I am willing to face the consequences of my actions and to demonstrate that I am committed to making things right. I am ready to be completely transparent with you and to put in the effort needed to heal and repair our relationship. Please, Mark, don't let something from the past destroy everything we have built together. Our marriage, our family, and our shared history are worth fighting for. I am deeply remorseful for my actions, and I am committed to doing everything in my power to mend what has been broken. I hope you can see that my regret is genuine and that my desire to make things right comes from a place of deep love and commitment to you and to our life together. If you are willing to give us a chance, I promise to be honest, open, and dedicated to our healing process. I understand that this is a huge request, and I am prepared to face the challenges that come with it. I want us to find a way back to each other, to rebuild the love and trust that we once had. I am ready to make this right, and I hope that, with time and effort, we can find a way to move forward together. Please don't let this be the end of our story. Our life together means more to me than anything else, and I am willing to fight for it with everything I have. Dad, please, Emily pleaded, her voice trembling with desperation. Mom has made mistakes, but she's trying to make it right. Can't you at least try to work through this? For me, for the grandkids. I looked at my daughter, her eyes mirroring the pain I felt. The depth of her anguish was palpable, and it only made my own struggle more intense. Bella, I love you. I love you more than anything in this world. But this isn't something I can just forgive and forget. It's been eating away at me for years, and I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. Natalie opened her mouth to speak again, but I raised my hand to silence her. Enough, Natalie. I don't want to hear anymore. You've said your piece. Now it's time for me to move on. I'm filing for divorce, I declared, the finality of the words sinking into the room. You can take whatever you want from the house, but I need you out of here by the end of the week. Dad, please, Emily begged again, her eyes brimming with tears. Don't do this. We can work through this as a family. I'm sorry, Bella, I said, my voice breaking with the weight of my decision. But this is something I have to do for myself. I can't live with this betrayal any longer. Natalie collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Emily knelt beside her, her own tears flowing freely as she tried to offer comfort. The scene was heart-wrenching, a poignant reminder of how deeply this situation had wounded us all. I stood up and walked out of the house, the burden of years of betrayal and pain pressing heavily upon me. As I drove away, memories of our life together flashed before me. I thought about the years of shared dreams, the laughter, and the moments of joy that had once filled our home. It was painful to realize that so much of it had been tainted by Natalie's affair and her deceit. Yet, I knew that staying with her would only prolong the agony. I needed to find a way to heal and move forward with my life. In the following days, I focused on sorting out my affairs. I filed for divorce and began making arrangements for Natalie to move out of the house. It was a logistical challenge, but I knew it was necessary for my own well-being. Emily tried to talk to me multiple times, but I couldn't bring myself to discuss it further. The decision was made, and I needed to concentrate on the future. The day Natalie moved out was marked by a mixture of sadness and relief. She packed only the essentials, leaving behind many of the items we had accumulated together over the years. As she walked out the door for the last time, she turned to me, her eyes filled with deep sorrow. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know, Natalie," I replied, my tone resolute, "but sorry isn't enough. Goodbye." With that, she left, and I was left alone in the house that had once been filled with love and laughter. It felt strangely empty, a shell of the home it had once been. I knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but I also understood that I needed to reclaim my life and seek a new path to happiness. Over the next few months, I threw myself into my work, spent time with friends, and began dating again. It wasn't easy. Each day was a step towards healing, but slowly, I started to see progress. I realized that while Natalie's betrayal had been devastating, it didn't define me. I was stronger than I had given myself credit for, and I could find happiness again. Emily, despite her initial heartbreak, eventually came to terms with the divorce. She continued to love her mother, but she understood why I couldn't stay. Our relationship grew stronger as we supported each other through this tumultuous time. It was a bittersweet comfort to know that while our family was fractured, we were still able to lean on each other. In the end, I found solace in knowing that I had done what was best for myself. I had reclaimed my life and my happiness. While the scars of Natalie's betrayal would always be there, they no longer controlled me. I was free to move forward and build a new future, one filled with hope and possibility. 5 years have passed since that fateful day when I finally walked away from Natalie. I spent those years rebuilding my life, but the pain and betrayal still echoed in my mind, especially after the shocking revelation that Emily wasn't my biological daughter. The truth came out during a heated argument with Natalie about the divorce settlement. In a moment of desperation, Natalie blurted out that Emily was Brian's daughter. A paternity test confirmed it, and the revelation was nothing short of devastating. The girl I had loved and raised as my own was not biologically mine. The betrayal cut even deeper, and it felt like the final, cruel twist in a long series of painful revelations. Emily, despite everything, stood by her mother. She couldn't understand why I was so adamant about moving on. It was like a knife in my heart when she chose to support Natalie after all that had happened. In the end, I decided to remove Emily from my will. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I felt I needed to take control of my life and my legacy. We split our possessions 50-50, with Natalie taking half of our savings and some personal items. I kept the house, but it felt hollow without the family I once thought was mine. Eventually, I sold it and moved into a modern apartment in the city. The transition was hard, but I found solace in my work and began dating again. During a business conference, I met Megan. She was a breath of fresh air, intelligent, kind, and genuinely interested in me. Megan had her own successful career as a marketing executive, and her life story was refreshingly free of the complications that had marred mine. She had been married once before, but her husband had tragically passed away in an accident. Despite her loss, Megan remained optimistic and full of life. We started dating, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive again. Megan had a way of making me forget the past and focus on the present. Her presence in my life was like a healing balm, slowly mending the wounds that Natalie's betrayal had left. While I was finding happiness again, Natalie's life took a darker turn. After the divorce, she moved into a small apartment and struggled to find a job. Her depression and guilt consumed her. She began drinking heavily, and her health deteriorated rapidly. The weight of her actions and the loss of her family took a severe toll on her. Natalie's attempts to reconnect with Emily were met with limited success. Emily, though supportive of her mother, couldn't fully grasp the depth of her actions. The strain between them grew, and Natalie felt increasingly isolated. She sought solace in alcohol, but it only pushed her further down a destructive path. Eventually, Natalie lost her job and ended up on welfare. Her once vibrant appearance faded as she battled her demons alone. I heard from mutual friends that she had been hospitalized several times due to alcohol poisoning and severe depression. It was heartbreaking to hear, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out. The woman I once loved had caused too much pain, and I needed to protect my newfound happiness. Emily, despite her efforts to help, couldn't save her mother from herself. She had her own family to care for, and the burden of her mother's decline weighed heavily on her. The rift between us remained, but I found peace in knowing that I had done what was best for me. Megan and I got married last year. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family. It was a day filled with love and hope for the future. Megan's presence in my life has been a constant source of strength and joy. Together, we've built a new life, one free from the shadows of the past. Looking back, I realize that the years of pain and betrayal were a necessary journey to bring me to this point. I've learned that forgiveness isn't always about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the chains of the past. While I may never fully forgive Natalie or forget what she did, I've found a way to move forward and embrace the happiness I deserve. Natalie's downward spiral serves as a tragic reminder of the consequences of betrayal and the importance of honesty in relationships. As for Emily, I hope that one day we can rebuild our relationship. But for now, I focus on the life I have with Megan, grateful for the second chance at happiness that life has given me.